you were considered for a position as FDA commissioner in the Trump administration. And I think in terms of the network state, in terms of the digital world, one of the seminal acts in the history of that was the banning of Trump from Twitter. Can you make the case for it and against it?
Sure. So first, let me talk about the FDA thing.
Sure.
So I was considered for a senior role at FDA, but I do believe that, and this is a whole topic, we can talk about the FDA. I do believe that just as it was easier to create Bitcoin than to reform the Fed, right? Reforming the Fed basically still hasn't happened, right? So just as it was easier to create Bitcoin than to reform the Fed, it will literally be easier to start a new country than to reform the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
It may take 10 or 20 years. I mean, think about Bitcoin, it's only about 13 years old, right? It may take 10 or 20 years to start a new network state with a different biomedical policy. But that is how we get out from this, perhaps the single worst thing in the world, which is harmonization, regulatory harmonization.
Can you describe
Sure.
regulatory harmonization?
Regulatory harmonization is the mechanism by which US regulators impose their regulations on the entire world. So they basically have a monopoly by US regulators. This is not just the FDA, it is SEC and FAA and so on and so forth. And for the same reason that a small company will use Facebook login, they will outsource their login to Facebook. A small country will outsource their regulation to the USA, okay, with all the attendant issues. Because, I mean, you know the names of some politicians. Can you name a single regulator at the FDA? No, right? Yet they will brag on their website that they regulate, I forget the exact numbers, I think it's like 25 cents out of every dollar, something along those lines, okay? It's like double digits, okay? That's a pretty big deal. And the thing about this is, people will talk about, quote, our democracy and so on. But many of the positions in, quote, our democracy are actually not subject to democratic accountability. You have tenured professors and you have tax-exempt colleges. You have the Sulzbergers at the New York Times who have dual-class stock. You have, a bunch of positions that are out of the reach of the electorate, and that includes regulators who have career tenure after just a few years of not necessarily even continuous service. So they're not accountable to the electorate. They're not named by the press. And they also aren't accountable to the market because you've got essentially uniform global regulations. Now, the thing about this is it's not just a government thing. It's a regulatory capture thing. Big pharma companies like this as well. Why? Because they can just get their approval in the US and then they can export to the rest of the world, right? I understand where that comes from as a corporate executive. It's such a pain to get, access in one place. So there's a team up, though, between the giant company and the giant government to box out all the small startups and all the small countries and lots of small innovation, right? There are cracks in this now, right? Mm-hmm. The FDA did not acquit itself well during the pandemic. For example, it denied, there's so many issues, but one of the things that even actually the New York Times reported, the reason that people thought there were no COVID cases in the US early in the pandemic was because the FDA was denying people the ability to run COVID tests. And the emergency use authorization was, emergency should mean like right now, right? Mm-hmm. But it was not, it was just taking forever. And so some labs did civil disobedience and they just disobeyed the FDA and just went and tested academic labs with threat of federal penalties, because that's what they are. They're like the police, okay? And so they were sort of retroactively granted immunity because NYT went and ran a positive story on them. So NYT's authority is usually greater than that of FDA. If they come into a conflict and NYT runs stories, then FDA kind of gets spanked, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not, probably neither party would normally think of themselves that way. But if you look at it, when NYT goes and runs stories on a company, it names all the executives and they get all hit. When it runs stories on a regulator, it just treats the regulator usually as if it was just some abstract entity. It's Zuckerberg's Facebook, but you can't name, the people who the career bureaucrats at FDA. Interesting, right?
Very interesting.
It's a very important point. Like that person who's like named and their face is known. Like you, just as an example, Zuckerberg's face and name. Most people don't know Arthur G. Sulzberger. They couldn't recognize him. Right? Yet he's a guy who's inherited the New York Times company from his father's father. That is unaccountable power. It's not that they get great coverage, it's that they get no coverage. You don't even think about them, right? And so it's invisibility, right?
There's some aspect why Fauci was very interesting. Because
he was public facing.
In my recent memory, there's not been many faces of scientific policy, of science policy.
Yeah.
And he became the face of that. And as there's some of it is meme, which is basically saying that he is science, or to some people represents science. But
or quote unquote science or whatever.
The positive aspect of that is that there is accountability when there's a face like that.
Right. But you can also see the Fauci example shows you why a lot of these folks do not want to be public, because they enter a political, and media minefield. I'm actually sympathetic to that aspect of it. What I'm not sympathetic to is the concept that in 2022, that the unelected, unfireable, anonymous American regulator should be able to impose regulatory policy for the entire world. We are not the world of 1945. It is not something where these other countries are even consciously consenting to that world. Just as give an example, there's this concept called challenge trials. Okay, the Moderna vaccine was available very, very early in the pandemic. You can just synthesize it from the sequence, and challenge trials would have meant that people who are healthy volunteers, okay, they could have been soldiers, for example, of varying ages, who are there to take a risk, their lives for their country potentially. Okay, it could have been just healthy volunteers, not necessarily soldiers, just patriots of whatever kind in any country, not just the US. But those healthy volunteers could have gone. And at the early stages of the pandemic, we didn't know exactly how lethal it was going to be, because Li Wenliang and 30-somethings in China were dying from this. It seemed like it could be far worse.
How lethal the virus would be.
Yeah, it may be, by the way, that those who were the most susceptible to the virus died faster earlier. It's as if you could imagine a model where those who were exposed and had the lowest susceptibility also had the highest severity and died in greater numbers early on. If you look at the graph, like deaths from COVID were exponential going into about April 2020, and then leveled off to about 7,500, 10,000 a day, and then kind of fell, right? But it could have gone to 75,000 at the beginning. So we didn't know how serious it was. So this would have been a real risk that these people would have been taking. But here's what they would have gotten for that. Basically, in a challenge trial, somebody would have been given the vaccine and then exposed to the virus and then put under observation. Mm-hmm. And then that would have given you all the data, because ultimately the synthesis of the thing, I mean, yes, you do need to scale up synthesis and manufacturing and what have you. But the information of whether it worked or not and was safe and effective, and like that could have been gathered expeditiously with volunteers for challenge trials.
And you think there would be a large number of volunteers?
Absolutely.
What's the concern there? Is there an ethical concern of taking on volunteers?
Well, so let me put it like this. Had we done that, we could have had vaccines early enough to save the lives of like a million Americans, especially seniors and so on. Okay. Soldiers and more generally first responders and others, I do believe there's folks who would have stepped up, to take that risk.
The heroes walk among us. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Like if military service is something which is it's a ritualized thing, people are paid for it, but they're not paid that much. They're really paid in honor, and in duty and patriotism. That is actually the kind of thing where I do believe some fraction of those folks would have raised their hand for this important, task. I don't know how many of them, but I do think that the volunteers would have been there. There's probably some empirical test of that, which is there's a challenge trials website. There's a Harvard prof who put out this proposal early in the pandemic, and he could tell you how many volunteers he got. But something like that could have just shortened the time from pandemic to functional vaccine, right? To days even, if you had actually really acted on it. The fact that didn't happen, and that the Chinese solution of lockdown, that actually, at the beginning, people thought the state could, potentially stop the virus, stop people in place. It turned out to be more contagious than that. Basically, no NPI, no non-pharmaceutical intervention really turned out to work that much, right? And actually, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I said something like, look, this is actually February 3rd, about a month before people, I was just watching what was going on in China. I saw that they were doing digital quarantine, like using WeChat codes to like block people off and so on. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but I said, look, if the coronavirus goes pandemic, and it seems it may, the extreme edge case becomes the new normal. It's every debate we've had on surveillance, deplatforming, and centralization accelerated. Pandemic means emergency powers for the state, even more than terrorism or crime. And sometimes a solution creates the next problem. My rough forecast of the future, the coronavirus results in quarantines, nationalism, centralization. And this may actually work to stop the spread, but once under control, states will not cede their powers, so we decentralize. And I didn't know whether it was going to stop the spread, but I knew that they were going to try to do it, right? And, look, it's hard to call every single thing right. And, I'm sure, someone will find some errors, but in general, I think that was actually pretty good for like early February of 2020, right? So it's my point though. The point is, rather than copying Chinese lockdown, what we should have had were different regimes around the world. To some extent, Sweden defected, from this, right? They had like no lockdowns or what have you. But really, the axis that people were talking about was lockdown versus no lockdown. The real axis should have been challenge trials versus no challenge trials. We could have had that in days, okay? And those are two examples on both vaccines and testing. There's so many more that I can point to.
So those are kind of decentralized innovations, and that's what FDA should stand for.
FDA can stand for it.
Or something like FDA, right?
So let's talk about that, right? Something like FDA. So this is very important. In general, the way I try to think about things is V1, V2, V3, as we've talked about a few times.
So FDA, V.
Well, right. So what was before FDA, right? So there was both good and bad before FDA because people don't necessarily have the right model of the past. Okay. So, if you ask people what was there before the FDA, they'll say, and by the FDA itself omits the, right? Their pronouns are just FDA, FDA. Okay. But basically.
Why is that important?
It's just something where.
Why is that either humorous or interesting to you?
They have a sort of in-group lingo where when you are kind of talking about them the way that they talk about themselves, it is something that kind of piques interest. It's kind of like, in LA, people say the 101 or the, right? Whereas in Northern California, they'll say 101, or people from Nevada will say Nevada, right? It just instantly marks you as like insider or outsider, okay? In terms of how the language works, right? And go ahead.
I mean, it just makes me sad because that lingo is part of the mechanism which creates the silo, the bubble of particular thoughts, and that ultimately deviates from the truth because you're not open to new ideas.
I think it's actually like, in Glorious Bastards, there's a scene in the bar. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, but it's good. You can't, just to censor you, this is like a Wikipedia podcast, like Wikipedia. You can't cite Quentin Tarantino films. No.
Okay.
Sorry.
So
take me back there.
Basically, like English start going like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I believe it's like the Germans start with like the thumb, something that you'd never know, right?
Yes.
I may be misremembering that, but I think that's right. Okay, so that's
FDA's got the lingo. All right,
right. Yes. So FDA's got the lingo. So coming back up, basically. Just talk about FDA and then come back to your question on the deplatforming.
So
thing.
what was V0 FDA? What's
so
V1? What does the future look like?
V1 was quote patent medicines. Okay, that's what some people say. But V1 was also Banting and Best. Okay, Banting and Best, they won the Nobel Prize in the early 1920s. Right? Why? They came up with the idea for insulin supplementation to treat diabetes. And they came up with a concept. They experimented on dogs. They did self-experimentation. They had healthy volunteers. They experimented with the formulation as well, right? Because just like you'd have like a web app and a mobile app, maybe a command line app, you could have, a drug that's administered orally or via injection or cream or, there's different formulations, right? Dosage, all that stuff, they could just like iterate on, okay, with willing doctor, willing patient. These folks who were affected, just sprang out of bed. The insulin supplementation was working for them. And within a couple of years, they had won the Nobel Prize and Eli Lilly had scaled production for the entire North American continent. Okay. So that was a time when pharma moved at the speed of software, when it was willing buyer, willing seller. Okay. Because the past is demonized as something that our glorious regulatory agency is protecting us from. Okay. But there's so many ways in which what it's really protecting you from is being healthy. Okay. As there's a zillion examples of this. I won't be able to recapitulate all of them just in this podcast, but if you look at a post that I've got, it's called Regulation, Disruption, and the Future, Technologies of 2013, Coursera PDF, okay? This lecture, which I'll kind of link it here so you can maybe put in the show notes if you want. This goes through like a dozen different examples of crazy things the FDA did, from the kind of stuff that was dramatized in Dallas Buyers Club, where they were preventing people from getting AIDS drugs, to their various attacks on quote raw milk, where they were basically saying, here's a quote from FDA filing in 2010. There's no generalized right to bodily and physical health. There's no right to consume or feed children any particular food. There's no fundamental right to freedom of contract. They basically feel like they own you. You're not allowed to make your own decisions about your food. There's no generalized right to bodily and physical health. Direct quote from their like written kind of thing. Okay. The general frame is usually that FDA says that it's protecting you from the big bad company, but really what it's doing is it's preventing you from opting out. Okay. Now, with that said, and this is where I'm talking about V3, as critical as I am of FDA or the Fed for that matter, I also actually recognize that like the Ron Paul type thing of end the Fed is actually not practical. End the Fed will just be laughed at. What Bitcoin did was a much, much, much more difficult task of building something better than the Fed. That's really difficult to do because the Fed and the FDA, they're like the hub of the current system. People rely on them for lots of different things, okay? And you're going to need a better version of them. And how would you actually build something like that? So with the Fed and with, SEC and the entire, the banks and whatnot, crypto has a pretty good set of answers for these things. And over time, all the countries that are not, or all the groups that are not the US establishment or the CCP will find more and more to their liking in the crypto economy. So that part I think is going, okay? We can talk about that. What does that look like for biomedicine? Well, first, what does exit the FDA look like, right? So there actually are a bunch of exits from the FDA already, which is things like right to try laws, okay, CLIA labs and laboratory developed tests, compounding pharmacies, off-label prescription by doctors, and countries that aren't fully harmonized with FDA. For example, Kobe Bryant, before he passed away, went and did stem cell treatments in Germany. Okay, stem cells have been pushed out, I think in part by the Bush administration, by other things. So those are different kinds of exits. Right to try basically means, at the state level, you can just try the drug. Okay, CLIA labs and LDTs. That means that's a path where you don't have to go through FDA to get a new device approved. You can just run it in a lab. Okay, compounding pharmacies. These were under attack. I'm not sure actually where the current statute is on this, but this is the idea that a pharmacist has some discretion in how they, prepare mixtures of drugs. Off-label prescription by MDs. So MDs have enough like weight in the system that they can kind of push back on FDA. And off-label prescription is the concept that a drug that's approved for purpose A can be prescribed for purpose B or C or D without going through another, whole new drug approval process. And then countries that aren't harmonized, right? So those are like 5 different kinds of exits from the FDA on different directions. So first, those exits exist. So for those people who are like, oh my God, we're all going to die, or he's going to poison us with non-FDA approved things or whatever, right? Like those exits exist. You've probably actually used tests or treatments from those. You don't even realize that you have, right? So it hasn't killed you, number one. Number 2 is actually testing for safety. There's safety, efficacy, and like comparative. Safety is it's actually relatively easy to test for. There's very few drugs that are like, there's TGN 1412. That's a famous example of something that was actually really dangerous to people, right, with an early test. So those do exist. Just acknowledge they do exist. But in general, testing for safety is actually not that hard to do, okay? And if something is safe, then you should be able to try it, usually, okay? Now, what does that decentralized FDA look like? Well, basically, you take individual pieces of it, and you can often turn them into vehicles. And this is like 50 different startups, but let me describe some of them. First, have you gotten any drugs or something like that recently? I mean, like prescribed drugs, prescription drugs? And it was like
now that you clarify, the answer is no.
Yeah.
No. Prescribed drugs, no.
Okay, so
not long. Maybe antibiotics a long time ago, maybe, but
all right.
No.
So you know how you have like a sort of like a wadded up chemistry textbook, the package insert that goes in
yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's wadded up chemistry textbook. I love it.
That's what it is, right? That's what a terrible user interface. We don't usually think of it that way. Why is the user interface so terrible? That's a web of regulation that makes it so terrible. And there's actually guys who tried to innovate just on user interface called like Help, I Need Help. That was like the name of the company a while back. And it was trying to explain the stuff in plain language, okay? Just on user interface, you can innovate. And why is that important? Well, there's a company called PillPack, which innovated on, quote, the user interface for drugs by giving people a thing which had like a daily blister pack. Mm-hmm. So it's like, here's your prescription, and you're supposed to take all these pills on the first and second. And basically, whether you had taken them on a given day was manifest by whether you had opened it for that specific day. Okay. This is way better than other kinds of so-called compliance methodologies. Like there are guys who try to do like an IoT pill where when you swallow it, it like gives you measurements. This was just a simple innovation on user interface that boosted compliance in the sense of compliance with a drug regimen dramatically, right? And I think they got acquired or what have you for a lot of money.
And hopefully utilized effectively.
Utilized effectively, right?
Oh, well, sometimes these companies that do incredible innovation, it really makes you sad when they get acquired. That leads to their death, not their scaling.
Sure. I mean, they did a lot of other good things, but this is one thing that they did well, right? So PillPack just shows what you can get with improving on user interface. We get reviews for everything, right? One thing that, like people have sort of, in my view, somewhat quoted out of context, are like, oh, Balaji thinks you should replace the FDA with Yelp for drugs. Actually, there's something called Phase 4, okay, of the FDA, which is so-called post-market surveillance. Do you know that that's actually something where, in theory, you can go and fill out a form on the FDA website, which basically says, I've had, a bad experience with a drug.
Like VAERS, but for drugs.
Yeah, so it's called MedWatch, right? And so you can do like voluntary reporting, and you can get like a PDF and just like upload it, right?
Is this a government? Is this .gov?
Yeah, it's Form 3500B.
I love it. It's HTML. It's going to be like from the 90s. It's going to have an interface designed by somebody who's a COBOL/Fortran programmer.
Right, here we go. So basically, the 3500B.
I hope to be proven wrong on that, by the way.
So 3500B, consumer voluntary reporting. When do I use this form? You were hurt or had a bad side effect. Use a drug which led to unsafe use, etc. Yeah. The point is, FDA already has a terrible Yelp for drugs.
Yeah.
It has a terrible version of it.
Yeah.
What would the good version look like? The fact that this fact you have to fill out a PDF to go and submit a report. How do you submit a report at Yelp or Uber or Airbnb or Amazon? You tap and their star ratings, right? So just modernizing FDA 3500B and modernizing Phase 4, okay, is a huge thing.
Can you comment on that? What incentive mechanism forces the modernization of that kind of thing?
Here's how it would work, or one possible.
To create an actual Yelp.
Yeah, here's how that would work, right? You go to the pharmacy or wherever, and you hold up your phone and you scan the barcode of the drug. Okay, what does you see? Instantly, you see global reports, right? By the way, because your biology, your physiology, that's global, right? Information from Brazil or from Germany or Japan on their physiological reaction to the same drug you're taking is useful to you. It's not like a national boundaries thing. So the whole nation state model of only collecting information by other Americans, so really you want a global kind of thing, just like, Amazon book reviews, that's a global thing. Other things are aggregate at the global level. Okay. So what you want is to see every patient report and every doctor around the world on this drug. Yeah. That might be really important to your rare or semi-rare condition. Just that alone would be a valuable site.
Who builds that site? It sounds like something created by capitalism. It sounds like
you could do it by capitalism.
It would have to be a company.
Yeah, you can definitely do. See,
but we don't have a world where a company is allowed to be in charge of that kind of thing.
Well, I don't know.
Health went down. It just seems like a lot of the.
So it depends, right? Basically, this is why you have to pick off individual elements, right? There's essentially a combination of first recognizing that the FDA is actually bad. Even be able to say that, let me put it like this. It does a lot of bad things. It is something which you need to be able to criticize. You might be like, well, that's obvious, right? Well, in 2010, for example, there's a book that came out, if anybody wants to understand FDA, it's called Reputation and Power.
Yeah. A lot of people don't want to criticize FDA.
Yeah, because they will retaliate against your biotech or pharma company.
Yeah, okay? And that retaliation can be initiated by a single human being.
Absolutely. The best analogy is, you think about the TSA, okay? Have you flown recently?
Yep.
Okay. Do you make any jokes about the TSA when you're in the TSA line?
Usually you don't want to, but they're a little more flexible. Okay. You know what? Can I tell a story?
Sure.
Which is, it was similar to this. I was in Vegas at a club. I don't go to clubs.
Okay.
I got kicked out I think the first time in my life for making a joke with a bouncer. And because I had a camera with me, and you're not allowed to have a camera, and I said, okay, cool, like I'll take it out. But I made a funny joke that I don't care to retell. But He was just a little offended. He was like, "You're out. I don't care who you are. I don't care who you're with." And then he proceeded to list me the famous people he has kicked out from that club. But there is, I mean, all of those. The reason I made the joke is I sensed that there was an entitlement to this particular individual, like where the authority has gotten to his head.
Respect my authority.
Yeah,
right.
I almost wanted to poke at that.
Right.
And I think the poking the authority, I quickly learned the lesson. Well, I have now been rewarded with the pride I feel for having poked authority, but now I'm kicked out of the club that would have resulted in a fun night with friends and so on. Instead, I'm standing alone crying in Vegas, which is not a unique Vegas experience.
Sure.
It's actually a fundamental Vegas experience. But that, I'm sure that basic human nature happens in the FDA as well.
That's exactly right. So just like with the TSA, just to extend the analogy, when you're in line at the TSA,
Yes.
right? You don't want to miss your flight. That could cost you hundreds of dollars. And so you comply with absolutely ludicrous regulations like, 3-ounce bottles. Well, you know what? You can take an unlimited number of 3-ounce bottles and you can combine them into a 6-ounce bottle through the terrorist technology called mixing.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
Advanced,
Yes.
right? And the thing about this is everybody in line, actually some fairly high, let's say call it influence or net worth or whatever, people fly, right? Millions and millions and millions of people are subject to these absolutely moronic regulations. It's all what, I think security theater is Schreier's term, right? A lot of people know this term. So millions of people are subject to it. It costs untold billions of dollars in terms of delays and whatnot. If you could just walk up to, right? It irradiates people. And this is another FDA thing, by the way. This is an FDA TSA team up. Okay. In 2010, the TSA body scanners, there were concerns expressed, but when it's a government to government thing, see, a .com is treated with extreme scrutiny by FDA, but it's another .gov. Well, they're not trying to make a profit, so they kind of just wave them on through. Okay. So these body scanners were basically like applied to millions and millions of people. And this huge kind of opt-in experiment. It's almost, I think it's quite likely, by the way, that if there was even a slightly increased cancer risk, that the net, morbidity and mortality from those would have outweighed the deaths from terrorism or whatever that were prevented, right? You can work out the numbers, but you can just get the math under reasonable assumptions. It's probably true. If it had any increased morbidity and mortality. I've not seen the recent things, but I've seen that concern expressed, 12 years ago. Point being that despite the cost, despite how many people are exposed to it, despite how obviously patently ludicrous it is, you don't make any trouble, nor do people organize protests or whatever about this, because it's something where people, the security theater of the whole thing is part of it. Oh, well, if we took them away, there would be more terrorism or something like that. People think, right?
But it is fascinating to see that the populace puts up with it, because it doesn't. One of my favorite things is to listen to Jordan Peterson, who I think offline, but I think also on the podcast, is somebody who resists authority in every way. And even he goes to TSA with a kind of suppressed, like all the instructions, everything down to whenever you have like the yellow thing for your feet, they force you to adjust it even slightly if you're off. Just even, I mean, it's like it's a Kafka novel. We're living like TSA. It makes me smile. It brings joy to my heart because I imagine Franz Kafka and I just walking through there, because it really is just deeply absurd. But and then the whole motivation of the mechanism becomes distorted by the individuals involved. The initial one was to reduce the number of terrorist attacks, I suppose.
Right. Now it's guns and drugs. Basically, it's like essentially what they've done is they've repealed the Fourth Amendment, right? Search and seizure, they can do it without probable cause. Everybody is being searched. Everybody's a potential terrorist. So they've got probable cause for everybody in theory. And so what they do, they'll post on their website the guns and drugs or whatever that they seized in these scanners. Well, of course, if you search everybody, you're gonna find some criminals or whatever. But the cost of doing that is dramatic. Moreover, the fact that people have sort of been trained to have, compliance. It's like the Soviet Union, right? Where, just grudgingly, all right, go along with this extremely stupid thing. What's my point? The point is, this is a really stupid regulation that has existed in plain sight of everybody for 20 years. We're still taking off our shoes. Okay, because some shoe bomber, whatever number of years ago, okay? All of this stuff is there, as opposed to, there's a zillion other things you could potentially do, different paradigms for, quote, airport security, but now apply that to FDA. Just like a lot of what TSA does is security theater, arguably all of it. A lot of what FDA does is safety theater. The difference is there's far fewer people who go through the aperture. They're the biotech and pharma CEOs. Okay, so you don't have an understanding of what it is to deal with them. Number one. Number two is the penalty is not a few $100s of missing your flight. It is a few $1 million or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for getting your company subject to the equivalent of a retaliatory wait time. Just like that bouncer threw you out, just like the TSA officer, if you make a joke or, they can just sit you down and make you lose your flight, right? So too, can the FDA just silently impede the approval of something and choke you out financially because you don't have enough runway to get funded, right? So just impose more wait time. Guess what? We want another 6 months. Data is going to take you another 6 months. Your company doesn't have the time. You die, right? If you live, you have to raise a round at some dilutive valuation. And now the price gets jacked up on the other side. That's the one thing that can give, by the way, in this whole process. When you push out timelines from days to get a vaccine approved or a vaccine evaluated rather via challenge trials to months or years, the cost during that time it just increases non-linearly, right? Because you can't iterate on the product. All the normal observations, if it takes you 10 years to launch a product versus 10 days, what's the difference in terms of your speed of iteration, your cost, et cetera, right? So this is part of it's not the only thing. There's other things. There's AMA and CPT, there's other things. But this is one of the things that jacks up prices in the US medical system, okay? So now you have something where these CEOs, they're going through this aperture. They can't tell anybody about it because if you read Reputation and Power, okay, I'm going to just quote this because it's an amazing, amazing book, right? It's written by a guy, Daniel Carpenter, who's a smart guy, but he's an FDA sympathizer. He fundamentally thinks it's like a good thing or what have you. Nevertheless, I respect Carpenter's intellectual honesty because he quotes the CEOs in the book, verbatim, and he gives some paragraphs. And essentially from their descriptions, it's like, think about like a Vietnam War thing where you've got a POW and they're like blinking through their eyes, I'm being tortured. Okay. That is the style. When you read Carpenter's book, you read the quotes from these CEOs. Let me see if I can find it.
Do you recommend the book?
It's a good book. Yeah. Or it's now a little bit outdated. Okay. Because it's like, almost 10 years old. Still, as a history of the FDA, it is well worth reading. And by the reason I say it, like the FDA is so insanely important. It's so much more important than many other things that people talk about, but they don't talk about it, right? I just want to read his little blurb for it, right? This is 2010. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is the most powerful regulatory agency in the world. How did the FDA become so influential? And how does it wield its extraordinary power? Reputation and Power traces the history of FDA regulation of pharmaceuticals, revealing how the agency's organizational reputation as being the primary source of its power is also one of its ultimate constraints. Carpenter describes how the FDA cultivated a reputation for competence and vigilance throughout the last century and how this organizational image has enabled the agency to regulate while resisting efforts to curb its own authority. First of all, just that description alone, you're like, wait a second. He is describing this as an active player. Mm-hmm. It's not like a DMV kind of thing, which is passed through. It's talking about cultivating a reputation, its power, resisting efforts to curb its own authority, right? The thing is, now you're kind of through the looking glass. You're like, wait a second, this is kind of language I don't usually hear for regulatory agencies. The thing is, the kind of person who becomes the CEO of a giant company, what do they want to do? They want to expand that company. They want to make more profit. Similarly, the kind of person who comes to run a regulatory agency or one of the subunits, that person wants to expand its ambit. Okay.
But is that always obvious? And sorry to interrupt, but for the CEO of the company, I know that the philosophical ideal of capitalism is you want to make the thing more profitable, but we're also human beings. Do you think there's some fundamental aspect to which we want to do a lot of good in the world?
Sure, but the fiduciary duty will push people to get the ambitious, the profit maximizing expansionist CEO is selected for, right? Basically, they believe, crucially, they're not just, this is important, they're not just, some of them are Grand Theft Auto, make as much money as possible, but they believe in the mission, okay? They've come to believe in the mission, and that is the person who's selected. Chomsky actually had this good thing, which is like, I believe that you believe what you believe, but if you didn't believe what you believe, you wouldn't be sitting here.
Right. So they select for the kind of people that are able to make a lot of money. And in that process, those people are able to construct a narrative that they're doing good, even though what they were selected for is the fact that they can make a lot of money.
Yeah, and they may actually be doing good. But the thing is, with CEOs, we have a zillion images in television and media movies of the evil corporation and the greedy CEO. We have some concept of what CEO failure modes are like. Okay. Now, when have you ever seen an evil regulator? Can you name a fictional portrayal of an evil regulator? Can you name an evil CEO?
Yeah,
Tons.
a lot. But that's so interesting. I'm searching for a deeper lesson here. You're right. I mean, there is portrayals, especially in sort of authoritarian regimes or of the Soviet Union, where there's bureaucracy. Chernobyl. You can kind of see within that there's the story of the regulator, but yeah, it's not as plentiful, and it also often doesn't have a face to it. It's almost like bureaucracy is this amorphous thing that results any one individual you see, they're just obeying somebody else. There's not a face to it of evil.
That's right.
The evil is the entire machine.
That's right. That's what I call the school of fish strategy, by the way. It's something where you are an individual and you can be signaled out, but there's more accountability for one person's bad tweets than all the wars in the Middle East, right? Because it's a school of fish.
Yeah.
Right? So if the establishment is wrong, if the bureaucracy is wrong, they're all wrong at the same time. Who could have known? Whereas if you deviate, then you are a deviation who can be hammered down. Okay? Now, the school of fish strategy is unfortunately very successful because truth is whatever. If you just always ride with the school of fish and turn when they turn and so on, unless there's a bigger school of fish that comes in, you basically can never be proven wrong, right? And this is actually, of course, someone who believes in truth and believes in, innovation and so on, just physiologically can't ride with the school of fish. You just have to say what is true or do what is true, right? Still, you've described correctly, how it's faceless, right? So I will give two examples of fictional portrayals of evil regulators. One is actually the original Ghostbusters. Okay.
Did not expect that one, but yes.
Yeah. So the EPA is actually the villain in that, where they flip a switch that lets out all the ghosts in the city. And essentially the guy is coming in with a head of steam as this evil regulator that's just totally arrogant, doesn't actually understand the private sector or the consequences of their actions. And they force and crucially, they bring a cop with them with a gun. So it shows that a regulator is not simply some piece of paper, but it is the police, right? And that cop with the gun forces the Ghostbusters to release the containment and the whole thing spreads.
Yeah.
A second example is Dallas Buyers Club, which is more recent. And that actually shows the FDA blocking a guy who with a life-threatening illness, with AIDS, from getting the drugs to treat his condition and from getting it to other people, right? Those are just two portrayals. But in general, what you find is when you talk about FDA with people, one thing I'll often hear from folks is why would they do that? Right? They have no mental model of this. They kind of think of it as, why would this thing, which they think of as sort of the DMV, they don't think of the DMV as this active thing, okay? Why would the FDA do that? Well, it is because it's filled with some ambitious people that want to keep increasing the power of the agency, just like the CEO wants to increase the profit of the company, right? I use that word ambit, right? Why ambit? Because these folks we know the term greedy, right? These folks are power hungry. They want to have the maximum scope. And sometimes regulatory agencies collide with each other, right? Even though FDA is under HHS, sometimes it collides with HHS and they've got regulations that conflict. For example, HHS says everybody's supposed to be able to have access to their own medical record. FDA didn't want people to have access to their own personal genomes. That conflicts, okay? And both of those are kind of anti-corporate statutes that were put out, with HHS's thing being targeted at the hospitals and FDA being targeted at the personal genomics companies, but those conflicted, right? It's a little bit like CFTC and SEC have a door jam over who will regulate cryptocurrency, right? Sometimes regulators fight each other, but they fight each other. They fight companies. They're active players. This Reputation and Power book, the reason I mention it is, I'm going to see if I can find this quote. So let me see if I can find this quote.
Reputation and Power, Organizational Image and Pharmaceutical Regulation at the FDA.
So Genentech's executive G. Kirk Robb, right? Robb would describe regulatory approval for his products as a fundamental challenge facing his company, and he would depict the administration in a particularly vivid metaphor. I've told the story hundreds of times to help people understand the FDA. When I was in Brazil, I worked on the Amazon River for many months selling terramycin for Pfizer. I hadn't seen my family for 8 or 9 months. They were flying into Sao Paulo, and I was flying down from some little village on the Amazon to Manaus and then to Sao Paulo. I was a young guy in his 20s. I couldn't wait to see the kids. One of them was a year-old baby. The other was 3. I missed my wife. There was a Quonset hut in front of just a little dirt strip with a single-engine plane to fly me to Manaus. I roll up and there's a Brazilian soldier there. The military revolution happened literally the week before. So this soldier is standing there with his machine gun and he said to me, "You can't come in." I speak in pretty good Portuguese by that time. I said, "My God, my plane, my family, I got to come in." He said again, "You can't come in." I said, "I got to come in." And he took his machine gun, took the safety off, and pointed at me and said, "You can't come in." And I said, "Oh, now I got it. I can't go in there." And that's the way I always describe the FDA. The FDA is standing there with a machine gun against the pharmaceutical industry. So you better be their friend rather than their enemy. They are the boss. If you're a pharmaceutical firm, they own you body and soul. Okay, that's the CEO of a successful company, Genentech.
Mm-hmm.
He said he's told the story hundreds of times, and regulatory approval is a fundamental challenge facing his company because if you are regulated by FDA, they are your primary customer. If they cut the cord on you, you have no other customers. And in fact, until very recently, with the advent of social media, no one would even tell your story. It was assumed that you were some sort of, corporate criminal that they were protecting the public from, that you were going to put poison in milk, like the melamine scandal in China. I'm not saying those things don't exist, by the way, they do exist. That's why people are like, they can immediately summon to mind all the examples of corporate criminals, right? That's why I mentioned those fictional stories, those templates. Even if Star Wars doesn't exist, how many times have you heard a Star Wars metaphor or whatever for something, right? Breaking Bad, go ahead.
Yeah, but the pharmaceutical companies are stuck between a rock and a hard place because the reputation, if they go to Twitter, they go to social media, they have horrible reputation. So it's like they don't know.
But why is that? Because reputation and power. FDA beat down the reputation of pharma companies, just like EPA helped beat down the reputation of oil companies. And as it says over here, right? In practice, dealing with the fact of FDA power meant a fundamental change in corporate structure and culture. At Abbott and at Genentech, Rob's most central transformation was in creating a culture of acquiescence towards a government agency. As was done at other drug companies in the late 20th century, Rob essentially fired officials at Abbott who were insufficiently compliant with the FDA. Mm-hmm. What that means is de facto nationalization of the industry via regulation. Just to hover on that. That's a really big deal. Because if their primary customer is this government agency, then it has nationalized it just indirectly, right? This is partially what's just happened with Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, the other MAGA, okay? They have been, that's funny.
Nice. Well done. Yeah. I didn't even think about that. That's well done.
Right? So it's I have this tweet, it's like MAGA Republicans and MAGA Democrats, right? Okay.
Oh, damn it. So many things you've said today will just get stuck in my head. It changes the way you think. Something about catchy phrasing of ideas makes them even more powerful. So yeah. Okay. So that's happening in the tech sector.
It's happening in tech. So Facebook is the outlier because Zuck still controls the company. But just like, why had tech had a good reputation for a while? Because there wasn't a regulatory agency whose justification was regulating these corporate criminals, right? Once that is the case, the regulatory agency basically comes back to Congress each year. And if you look at its budget approvals, it's saying, we find this many guys, we found this many violations, right? They have an incentive to exaggerate the threat in the same way that a prosecutor or, policeman has a quota, right? Like, these are the police. One way I describe it also is like, like a step-down transformers. You have high voltage electricity that's generated at the power plant, and it comes over the wires, and then there's step-down transformers that turn it into a lower voltage that you can just deal with out of your appliances, right? Similarly, you have something where the high voltage of like the US military or the police, and that is transmuted down into a little letter that comes in your mailbox saying, pay your $50 parking ticket. Where it's a piece of paper, so you don't see the gun attached to it. But if you were to defy that, it's like Grand Theft Auto, where you get 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars, and eventually, you have some serious stuff on your hands. Okay, so once you understand that, every law is backed by force, like that Brazilian guy with the machine gun that Rob mentioned, these guys are the regulatory police. Okay. Now, see, for a time, what happened was you had the captured industry because all of the folks who were in pharmaceuticals were, as Carpenter said, a culture of acquiescence towards the FDA. The FDA was their primary customer. So just like, in a sense, it's rational. Amazon talks about being customer obsessed, right? What Rob did was rational for that time, right? What G. Rob did was saying our customer is the FDA. That's our primary customer. Nobody else matters. They are satisfied first. Every single trade-off that has to be made is FDA, right? And really, that's why the two most important departments at many pharmaceutical companies, arguably all, are regulatory affairs and IP, not R&D, right? Because one is artificial scarcity of regulation, which jacks up the price, and the other is artificial scarcity of the patent, which allows people to maintain the high price, right? So this entire thing is just like, college education. These things may at some point have been a good concept, but the price has just risen and risen and risen until it's at the limit price and beyond, okay? Mm-hmm. So what has changed? What's changed is in the 2010s, the late 2000s and 2010s and so on, with the advent of social media, with the advent of a bunch of millionaires who are independent, with the advent of Uber and Airbnb, right? With the advent of cryptocurrency, with the diminution of trust in institutions, it used to be really taboo to even talk about the FDA as potentially bad in 2010, 2009, okay? But now people have just seen faceplant after faceplant by the institutions, and people are much more open to the concept that they may actually not have it all together. And I think it's you could probably see some tracking poll or something like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's like a 20 or 30 point drop after the CDC failed to control disease and the FDA failed, and the entire biomedical regulatory establishment and scientific establishment was saying masks don't work before they do. This was just a train crash of all the things that you're paying for that you supposedly think are good. As I mentioned, one response is to go QAnon, and people will say, oh, don't trust anything. But the better response is decentralizing FDA. Okay. So I will say one other thing, which is I mentioned, this concept of improving the form 3500B, where you scan. Go ahead.
No, yeah, right. That just makes me laugh. I could just tell the form sucks by the fact that it has that code name.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Exactly. Right.
UX is broken at every layer.
Yeah. So they have a bad Yelp for drugs. Could we make a better one? We could make a better one. Just modern UX. Mm-hmm. The key insight here, by the way, which is a non-obvious point, and I've got a whole talk on this actually, that I should probably release. I actually did almost 8-9 years ago. It's called Regulation is Information. Product quality is a digital signal. Okay. What do I mean by that? Basically, when I talk about exit the Fed, that's the crypto economy, right? What does exit the FDA look like? Well, one key insight is that many of the big scale tech companies can be thought of as cloud regulators rather than land regulators. What do I mean by that? Well, first, what is regulation? People do want a regulated marketplace. They want A, quality ratings, like on a 1 to 5 star scale, and B, bans of bad actors, like the 0-star frauds and scammers and so on. And these are distinct, right? Somebody who's like a low quality but well-intentioned person is different than a smart and evil person. Those are two different kinds of failure modes you could have in a marketplace, right? Why is it rational for people to want a regulated marketplace, especially for health? Because they want to pay essentially one entry cost, and then they don't have to evaluate everything separately where they may not have the technical information to do that, yes. Right? You don't want to go to Starbucks and put a dipstick into every coffee to see if it's poisoned or something like that. You sort of want to enter a zone where you know things are basically good, and you pay that one diligence cost on the zone itself, right? Whether it's a digital or physical zone, and then the regulator's taking care of it, and they've baked in the regulatory cost into, some subscription fee of some kind, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing is, the model we've talked about is the land regulator of a nation state in a territorially bounded thing. But the cloud regulator, what's a cloud regulator? That is Amazon star ratings, that's Yelp, that is eBay, that is Airbnb, that is Uber and Lyft, and so on and so forth. It's also actually Gmail and Google. Why? Because you're doing spam filtering, and you are doing ranking of mails with a priority inbox, right? With Google itself, they ban malware links, right? So the bad actors are out and they're ranking them, right? How about Apple, the App Store, right? They ban bad actors and they do star ratings. When you start actually applying this lens, PayPal, they've got a reputation. Every single web service that's at the scale of like tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people has had to build a cloud regulator. And the crucial thing is it scales across borders. So you can use the data from Mexico to help somebody in Moldova or vice versa, right? Because it's fundamentally international, right? Those ratings, you have a network effect. And there's another aspect to it, which is these are better regulators than the land regulators. For example, Uber is a better regulator than the taxi medallions. Why? Every ride is GPS tracked. There's ratings on both the driver and the passenger side. Both parties, know that payment can be rendered in a standard currency, right? If you have below a certain star rating on either side, you get deplatformed and so on to protect either a rider or driver, and on, right? What does that do? Think about how much better that is than taxi medallions. Rather than a 6-month or annual inspection, you have reports from every single rider. Okay. Before Uber, it was the taxi drivers and taxi regulators were in a little monopoly locally, okay, because they were the persistent actors in the ecosystem. Taxi riders had nothing in common, didn't even know each other. In New York, some guy gets in a taxi, another guy, they had no way to communicate with each other. So the persistent actors in the ecosystem were the regulators and the drivers, and they had this cozy kind of thing, and medallion prices just kept going up, and this was this sort of collaboration on artificial scarcity. Afterwards, with Uber and Lyft and other entrants, you had something interesting, a different kind of regulator driver fusion. If you assume regulatory capture exists and lean into it, Uber is the new regulator and Uber drivers are the drivers. Lyft is the competing regulator and Lyft drivers are the new drivers. Okay. So you have a regulator driver fusion versus another regulator driver fusion. You no longer have a monopoly. You have multiple parties. Okay. You have a competitive market. This is the concept of like polycentric law, right? Where you have multiple different legal regimes in the same jurisdiction overlapping that you can choose between with a tap of a button, right? All these concepts from like libertarian theory, like, polycentric law or catalytic, all these things are becoming more possible now that the internet has increased microeconomic leverage. And because that exit is now possible. Now, you may argue, oh, well, Lyft and Uber, they're not profitable anymore. And there's two different criticisms of them. One is, oh, they're not profitable, or, oh, they're charging too much. And I think part of this is because of certain kinds of, the regulatory state has caught up to try to make them uncompetitive. For example, they don't allow people in some states to identify themselves as independent contractors, even if they are part-time, okay? There's various other kinds of rules and regulations. In Austin for a while, Uber was even banned, what have you, right? Net though, like Uber, Grab, Gojek, Lyft, Didi, like ride sharing as a concept is now out there. And whatever the next version is, whether it's self-driving, like while it's like a very hard fought battle and the regulatory state keeps trying to push things back into the garage, this is a fundamentally better way of just doing regulation of taxis. Similarly, Airbnb for hotels. I mean, I don't even have to, it's basically the same thing. Okay. And now Airbnb could use competition. I think that it would be good to have, like competition for them. And there are other kinds of sites opening up. But the fundamental concept of the cloud regulator now, let's apply it here. Once you realize regulation is information, the way you'd set up a competitor to FDA or SEC or FAA or something like that is you just do better reviews. Like, just start with that. That's pure information. You're under free speech. That's like still, the most defended thing, literally just publishing reviews, and not just reviews by any old person. It turns out that FDA typically will use expert panels. Where there's expert panels, it's like professors from Harvard or, things like that. So what that is this concept of a reputational bridge. What you want to do is you want to have folks who are, let's say, biotech entrepreneurs, or they're, profs like Sinclair or what have you. You do want to have the reviews of the crowd, okay? But you also want to have, especially in medicine, you want to have the reviews of experts of some kind. So there's going to be defectors from the current establishment. Okay, just like, there are profs who defected from computer science academia to become Larry and Sergey and whatever, they weren't profs, but they were grad students, right? In the same way, you'll have defectors who have the credentials from the old world, but can build up the new. Just like there's folks from Wall Street who have come into cryptocurrency and helped legitimate it, right? Just like there's folks who left Sulzberger to come to Substack, okay? We have these folks who, by defecting, they help, and then they're also supplemented by all this new talent coming in, right? That combination of things is how you build a new system. It's not completely by itself, nor is it trying to reform the old. It's some fusion, okay? So in this new system, who do you have? You have like the most entrepreneurial and innovative MDs. You have the most entrepreneurial and innovative professors, and you have the founders of actual new products and stuff. And they are giving open source reviews of these products. And they're also building a community that will say, look, we want this new drug, or we want this new treatment, or we want this new device, and we're willing to crowdfund 10,000 units. So please give us the thing, and we'll write a very fair review of it, and we'll also all evaluate it as a community and so on. So you turn these people from just passive patients into active participants in their health. That's the community part, and they've got the kind of biomedical technical leadership there. Now, what is the kind of prototype of something like this? Something like VitaDAO is very interesting. Things like Molecule DAO are very interesting. It'll start with things like longevity, right? And why is that? Because the entire model of FDA, this 20th century model, is wait for somebody to have a disease and then try to cure them. Okay. Versus, saying an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Why are we not actually tracking folks and getting a constant dashboard on yourself so you can see whether things are breaking, and then you deal with it just like you've got server uptime things. You don't wait necessarily for the site to go down. You start seeing, response rates are spiking. We need to add more servers, right? You have some warning. Okay. Even 10 years ago, there's this article called The Measured Man in The Atlantic, where this guy, physicist Larry Smarr, okay, what he was doing is he was essentially doing a bunch of measurements on himself. And he was finding that there were predictors of inflammation that were spiking. And he went to the doctor, showed the charts, and the doctor was like, I can't do anything with this. Mm-hmm. Then it turned out to be an early warning of like a serious condition. And he had to, I think, go for surgery or something. And he was starting to think, well, look, the way that we're doing medicine right now is it's not quite like pre-germ theory of disease, but it is pre-continuous diagnostics. Okay. Continuous diagnostics, just to talk about this for a second, this is, I mentioned one angle on which you go after FDA, which is like the better phase 4, right? I've mentioned the concept of better reviews in general, okay? I mentioned VitaDAO, which is like a community that is going after longevity. Let's talk about continuous diagnostics. So basically, we know better what is going on in Bangalore or Budapest than in our own body. That's actually kind of insane to think about. This stuff that it's all the other side of the world, 10,000 miles away, but, a few millimeters away, you don't really know what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. And that's starting to change with all the quantified self devices, the hundreds of millions of Apple Watches and Fitbits and stuff, right? You're also starting to see continuous glucose meters, which is very important. They're starting to give you readouts. People are seeing, wow, this is spiking my insulin, or rather, this is spiking my blood sugar. And it might be something you didn't predict. It varies for different people. For some people, a banana isn't a big deal. For others, it's actually quite bad for their blood sugar. What happens when you extend that? Well, about 10 years ago, a guy, Mike Snyder, professor at Stanford, did something called the Integrome, where he just threw the kitchen sink of all the diagnostics he could at himself over the period of, I think, a few weeks or a few months. I forget the exact duration. And he's able to do things where you could see during that period, he got a cold or something. And you could see in the expression data, the gene expression data, that he was getting sick before he felt sick. He could also see that something about that viral infection, made him develop diabetes-like symptoms, if I'm remembering it accurately. So you could see, wait a second, these are things that are that I can see in my readouts that I would only have the vaguest interpretation of as like a human being, right? And moreover, he could take, I don't think he did this, but if you took treatments, if you took drugs, right, you could actually show what your steady state was if you tracked over time, show what your disease state or sick state was, and then this drug pushes you back into non-disease state. You can actually get a quantitative readout of what, steady state was, right? So that, and that steady state, your expression levels across all these genes, your small molecules, basically everything you can measure, that's going to vary from person to person. Right? What's healthy and natural for you may be a different baseline than for me. For example, people who are South Asian or have dark skin tend to have vitamin D deficiency. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we need a lot of sunlight. So often inside you're tapping on your screen. So what do? Take actually significant vitamin D infusions. Okay. That's a small example of where baselines differ between people. Okay. So continuous diagnostics, what could that mean? That could mean, it's things like the continuous glucose meter. It's quantified self. It's like continuous blood testing, right? So you have a so-called mobile phlebotomist. This is something which Phlebotomist takes blood, right? Mobile phlebotomy would come to your office, come to your remote office. This is a great business for people. I think, you can revisit this in 2022. People tried this in the 2010s, but I think it's worth revisiting. Mobile phlebotomist comes every week or every month, takes blood, runs every test, right? Maybe that's, a few $1,000s a year, maybe eventually gets to a few $100s a year. And that's expensive in some ways, but boy, that's better health insurance in other ways.
Yeah, it's amazing. So there's a bunch of companies that do this, and I actually would love to learn more about them. One of them is a company called Inside Tracker that sponsors this podcast. They do that, but the reason I really appreciate them, they're the first ones that introduced me to like how easy it is, but it's also depressing how little information, exactly as you beautifully put once again, how little information we have about our own body in a continuous sense.
Yes.
And actually, also sadly, even with Inside Tracker, as I collect that data, how not integrated that data is with everything else.
Right.
If I wanted to opt in, I would I can't just like riffing off the top of my head, but I would like Google Maps to know what's going on inside my body.
That's right.
Maybe I can't intuit at first why that application is useful, but there could be an incredible, that's where the entrepreneurial spirit builds, is like, what can I do with that data? Can I make the trip less stressful for you and adjust the Google Maps thing kind of thing?
That's right.
Yeah.
So, one of the things about this, by the way, is because there are so many movies made about Theranos, okay, that's one of the reasons why people have sort of been scared off from doing diagnostics to some extent. Okay. Why? Because VCs are like, oh, is this another Theranos? And like the diligence and everything, everyone's looking at it. Oh, blood testing, 1 drop of blood, huh? Hurts with the recruiting. Essentially, a lot of the media and stuff around that basically has pathologized the thing that we want to have a lot more entrance in, right? Now, one way of thinking about it is FDA has killed way more people than Theranos has. All right, way more. Just take drug lag alone, okay? Whenever you have a drug that works and reduced morbidity and mortality after it was actually generally available, but was delayed for months or years, the integral under that curve is the excess morbidity and mortality attributable to FDA's drug lag. You could go back and do that study across lots and lots of different drugs, and you probably find quite a lot. Alex Tabarrok and others have written on this, right? Daniel Henninger has written on this, okay? That's just like one example. I gave the pandemic example, the fact that they held up the EUAs for the tests and didn't do challenge trials. That's like, that's like 1 million American dead that could have been orders of magnitude less if we had gotten the vaccine out to vulnerable populations sooner, okay? So you're talking about something that has a total monopoly on global health, and you can't know what it is without that unless you have zones that are FDA free, but that have some form of regulation. As I mentioned, it's a V3. It's not going back to zero regulation, everybody, man for itself, but it's a more reputable regulator, just like, Uber is a better regulator than the taxi medallions, right?
Yeah, you're painting such an incredible picture. You're making me wish you were FDA commissioner. But
there are a bunch of people who tweeted something like that after the, with the pandemic. Whatever. Go ahead. Yeah.
Is that possible? Like, if you were just given, if you became FDA commissioner, could you push for those kinds of changes, or is that really something that has to come from the outside?
The short answer is no. And the longer answer, meaning
that'd be funny if you're like, the short answer is no, the long answer is yes.
So basically, see, a CEO of a company, it's very difficult. They can hire and fire, right? Mm-hmm. So in theory, they can do surgery on the organism. And Steve Jobs took over Apple and was able to hire and fire, raise money, do this, that. He basically had root over Apple. Like, he was a system administrator, right? Mm-hmm. He had full permissions. Okay. As FDA commissioner, you do not have full permissions over FDA, let alone the whole structure around it, right? If you're FDA commissioner, you are not the CEO of the agency. Okay. Lots of these folks there have career tenure. They can't be fired. They can't even really be disciplined. There's something called the Douglas factors. You ever heard the Douglas factors? It's like the Miranda rights for federal employees. Okay. The right to remain says it. So basically, if you've heard that federal employees can't be fired, the Douglas factors are how that's actually operationalized. Mm-hmm. When you try to fire somebody, it's this whole process where they get to appeal it and so on and so forth. And they're sitting in the office while you're trying to fire them. And they're complaining to everybody around them that this guy's trying to fire me, he's such a bad guy, blah, blah, right? And everybody around, even if, they may think that guy is doing a bad job, they're like, wait a second, he's trying to fire you. He might try to fire me too. And so anybody who tries to fire somebody at FDA just gets a face full of lead for their troubles. What they instead will do is sometimes they'll just transfer somebody to the basement or something so they don't have to deal with them if they're truly bad. Okay. But the thing about this is there is only one caveat, Douglas factor number 8. The notoriety of the offense or its impact upon the reputation of the agency. There's that word again, reputation and power. Mm-hmm. So the one way you can truly screw up within a regulatory bureaucracy is if you sort of endanger the annual budget renewal. Think of it as like this mini Death Star that's coming to dock against the max Death Star for its annual refuel. And it's talking about all the corporate criminals that it's prosecuted, the quotas, like the police quotas, the ticketing, and if they don't have a crisis, they will invent one. Just like TSA, just like other agencies you're more familiar with, you can kind of map it back. Look at the guns and drugs we've seized. And so you have an incentive for, creating these crises or manufacturing them or exaggerating them. And if you endanger that refueling, that annual budget renewal or, what have you, then the whole agency will basically be like, okay, you're bad and you can be disciplined or sometimes, with rare except, you can be booted. But what that means is that FDA commissioner is actually a white elephant. It's a ceremonial role, really, right? The term white elephant's basically, the Maharaja gives you a white elephant as a gift. Seems great. Next day, it's eaten all of your grass. It's pooped on your lawn. It has just put a foot on your car and smashed it, but you can't give it away. It's a white elephant. The Maharaja gave it to you, mm-hmm. right? That's what being FDA commissioner is. It's the kind of thing where and a lot of people are drawn in like moths to the flame for these titles of the establishment. I want to be head of this. I want to be head of that, right? And really what it is, it's becoming head of Kazakhstan in the mid-1980s in the Soviet Union, the Kazakhstan SSR, right? Soviet Socialist Republic, before the thing was going to crumble potentially, right? In many ways, it's becoming, folks who are just totally status obsessed getting these positions. But a lot of the merit, all the folks with merit are kind of leaving the government and going into, tech or crypto or what have you, right? So even if these agencies were hollow before, in some ways, they're becoming hollower because they have less talent there, right? So A, you can't hire and fire very easily. You can hire a little bit. You can't really fire. B, a lot of the talent has left the building, what was there. C, we're entering the decentralizing era. And D, be like Satoshi. Satoshi founded Bitcoin because he knew you could not reform the Fed. Everybody's trying to go and reform. And the reason they're trying to reform is we haven't figured out the mechanism to build something new. And now perhaps we have that. So I've named a few of them, right? I'll name one more. Related to deliverance. Fitness is actually the back door to a lot of medicine. Okay. Why is that? You go to any, conference, it could be neurology, it could be cardiology. You'll find somebody who's giving a talk that says something along the lines of fitness is the ultimate drug. Maybe not today when people are saying, oh, fat phobic, whatever, but not too many years ago, you would see somebody, people saying fitness is the ultimate drug. If we could just prescribe fitness in a pill, that would improve your cardiovascular function, your neurological function, deals with depression.
By the way, in that case, the use of the word drug means medicine. So
medicine. Yeah. Sure.
Fitness is the ultimate medicine. Yeah.
Yeah. The ultimate medicine, right? So if they could just prescribe the effects of it, it's just boom, just massive effect, right? You're fit enough, you do resistance training, it helps with, preventive diabetes, every kind of thing in the world, you see a significant treatment effect. Yet your fitness is your own responsibility. You go to some gym, 24-hour fitness. What do they have? They have on the wall exhortations like your body is your responsibility, right? Am I right?
Yeah.
And go ahead. But
no, it's hilarious. Yes.
It's funny, but it's true, right?
Yeah, it's funny because it's true.
And so your fitness, your diet, that's your responsibility. But when you go into a doctor's office, suddenly it becomes lie back and think of England. Okay. Suddenly you become passive. Suddenly, oh, your doctor is Dr. Google. Well, your doctor must be a moron. You're going and trying to take care of yourself. You're Googling symptoms. Oh, how stupid you are. I have a medical degree. And that doctor, see, the thing is, if you come in and you've self-diagnosed or you've done some of your own research, if you're right, and if they've got an ego about it, they're undermined. And if you're wrong, they're like, haha, arrogant. But either way, if they've got this kind of mindset, they have an incentive to resist the patient taking care of themselves. Isn't that the doctor's job, right? And they're kind of taught to behave like this, many of them. So what that means then is that intervention of that 15 or 30-minute appointment with the doctor, whatever drug they prescribe, better hit you like Thor's hammer to put you back on the straight and narrow, because that's only with you for like a few seconds, a few minutes or whatever. The doctor's only with you for a few minutes. The drug is only, some drugs are very powerful, so they actually do work like this, okay? But your fitness is your own responsibility, and that's a continuing forcing function every day. And again, we get back to decentralization, right? The decentralization of responsibility from somebody thinking of themselves merely as a patient to an active participant in their own health, who's doing their own monitoring of their own health, right? And logging all of their stuff, who's eating, properly and looking at the effect of their diet on things like their, continuous glucose monitor as a V1, but other things, right? Who is, as fit as they can possibly be. Like, these are kind of obvious things, but why is this the back door to medicine? Because since the FDA only regulates those things that are meant to diagnose and treat a disease, all the stuff that is meant to improve an otherwise healthy person is potentially out of their purview. Supplements are one interesting aspect that they were carved out in the mid 90s, and that's why the supplement industry is big, because FDA doesn't have as tight a rein on that. But all of the Fitbit, CGM, continuous glucometer type stuff, you can crank out all kinds of things that help people get fitter, that will also actually have just general health value, but you're not, quote, marketing them to diagnose or treat, a disease. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
You're marketing them for the purpose of fitness. This is a market. Why? Because psychologically, people, they don't like paying to get back to normal, but they will absolutely pay tons of money to get better than normal. They'll pay for fitness, they'll pay for makeup, they'll pay for hair, they'll pay for this and that, right? So that's actually the back door, and you can do tons of things there where obviously being healthier is also protective. You can actually show the studies on this. So this way you build out all the tooling to get healthier, and that actually helps on this axis. A few other things are just kind of a U.S. medical system while I'm on it, because you got me on this topic.
I love this.
Okay. So
this is the most eloquent exploration of the U.S. medical system and how to improve it, how to fix it, and what the future looks like.
Yeah. So
love it.
So basically, part of it is decentralizing control back to the individual, right? Now, I have talked about FDA at length, but let me talk about some other broken parts of the U.S. system, right? There's like AMA, there's CPT, there's CPOM, there's this, like all these regulations, which, see, normally in capitalism, you have a buyer and a seller, right? Duh. In medicine, you have third-party regulation and fourth-party pricing and fifth-party payment. Okay, so third-party regulation, FDA is regulating it. Fourth-party pricing, it is the CPT codes, right? Fifth-party payment, it's the insurance companies, all right? And just to discuss these bits of the system, first, why are some people against capitalism in medicine? I actually understand why they're against it, because they are visualizing themselves on a gurney when they're being wheeled in, and now somebody at their moment of vulnerability is charging this insane price for their care. And many people in the US have had this horrible experience where they're bankrupted or scared of being bankrupted by medical bills. Therefore, the concept of adding more capitalism to medicine scares them, and they think it's horrible, and you're some like awful, greedy tech bro kind of thing. All right. Let me say I understand that concern, and let me tease that apart a little bit, right? Basically, the most capitalistic areas of medicine are the most functional areas of medicine. So that's, say, the places where you can walk in and walk out, okay? Whether that's dentistry, dermatology, plastic surgery, even veterinary medicine, which is not human, okay? Where you can make a conscious decision, say, okay, I want this care or I don't want this. I see a price list. I can pay cash, right? If I don't like it, I go to another dermatologist. There's few dermatological emergencies. That's why dermatologists have a great quality of life, okay? By contrast, when you're being wheeled in on a gurney, you need it right now, okay? And you're unconscious or what have you, or you're not in a capacity to deal with it, right? And so these are the two extremes. It's like ambulatory medicine, you can walk around and pick, and like ambulance medicine, okay? And what that means is the more ambulatory the medicine, the more legitimate capitalism is in that situation. People are okay with a dermatologist basically turning you down because you don't have enough money and you go to another dermatologist because you can comparison shop there. It's not usually an emergency, right? Whereas if you're coming in with an ambulance, then people don't want to be turned down, and I understand why, okay? What this suggests, by the way, is that you should only have insurance for the edge cases. Insurance should only cover the ambulance, not the ambulatory. I mean, most people are losing money on insurance, right? Because most people are paying more in premiums than they are getting out. It's just that this huge flight of dollars through the air that no one can make heads or tails out of. Oh, the other aspect that's obviously broken, is employer-provided health insurance, which just started after World War II. So, auto insurance is in a much more competitive market. You don't whip out your auto insurance card at the gas station to pay for your gas, right? You only whip it out when there's a crash, right? That's what, quote, health insurance should be. And the Singapore model is actually a pretty good one for this, where they have sort of a mandatory HSA. You have to put some money in that, and that pays for your healthcare bills, but then it's cash out of that. It's like a separate pocket, sort of forced savings to pay for
health savings accounts.
Health savings account, right? The thing about this is, once you realize, well, first, ambulatory medicine is capitalistic medicine, ambulance medicine is socialist medicine, okay? You want to shift people more towards ambulatory. Guess what? That's in their interest as well. Now that brings us back to the monitoring, right? The continuous monitoring, where whether eventually it's Mike Snyder's Integrum, the V1 is the quantified self and the Apple Watch and the continuous glucose meters, and the VN is the Mike Snyder Integrum. There's a site called Q.bio, which is doing this also, right? Eventually, this stuff will hopefully just be in a device that just measures tons and tons of variables on you, right? There's ways of measuring some of these metabolites and without breaking the skin. So it's not, you don't have to keep breaking the skin over and over. There's various ways of doing that. So now you've got something where you've got the monitoring, you've got the dashboards, you've got the alerts, and just like this Larry Smarr guy that I mentioned, the Measured Man, you might be able to shift more and more things to ambulatory. And one of the things about this also is the medical system is set up in a bad way, where the primary care physician is the one who is not the top of their class. But the guys who are at the bottom of the pinball machine, the surgeons and the radiologists, once your stuff is already broken, okay, they're the ones who are paid the most. So a lot of the skill collects at the post-break stage, right? Where you actually want Doogie Howser, MD, is at the upstream stage, okay? So you want this amazing, amazing doctor there, right? How could we get that? I mentioned the app that doesn't exist, which is like a better version of the 3500B, right? Here's another app that doesn't exist, and this is one that FDA has actively quashed. Why can't you just take an image of a mole or something like that? With the incredible cameras we have, a huge amount of medical imaging should be able to be done at home, and it goes to doctors, whether it's in the US or the Philippines or India. I mean, teleradiology exists, right? Why can you not do that for dermatology, for everything else? You should be able to literally just hold the thing up, and with a combination of both AI and MDs, just diagnose. That should exist, right? Answer is, there's a combination of both American doctors and the FDA that team up to prevent this or slow this. One argument is, the AI is not better than a human 100% of the time because it's not deployed yet. Therefore, it could make an error. Therefore, it's bad, even if it's better than 99% of doctors 99% of the time. Another argument is the software has to go through design control. Okay. Now, basically, once you understand how FDA works, basically imagine the most bureaucratic, frozen process for code deployment at any company ever. And that is the most nimble thing ever relative to FDA's design review. So just to review, A, talked about how FDA was blocking all this stuff. B, talked about why ambulatory medicine is capitalist medicine, ambulance medicine is socialist medicine. C, talked about how with the diagnostic stuff, we can shift it over to ambulatory. D, talked about how there's lots of things where you could have a combination of doctor and AI in an app that you kind of quickly self-diagnose. Some of this is happening now. Some of the telemedicine laws were relaxed during COVID, where now people, a doctor from Wyoming can prescribe for somebody in Minnesota. Like, some of that stuff was relaxed during COVID. Okay. There's other broken things in the medical system. I'll just name two more and then kind of move on. Okay. I mentioned like AMA and CPT. Okay.
Those are two regulatory bodies.
AMA, American Medical Association, CPT, current procedural terminology. Okay. Basically, Marx's labor theory of value, where people are supposed to be paid on their effort, right? Of course, the issue with this is that you'd be paying a physicist to try to dunk, and they'd be trying, but they wouldn't actually probably be able to do it. They'd be trying real hard. Whereas you actually want to pay people on the basis of results, right? Cheaply attained results are actually better than expensively attained non-results. Perhaps obvious, okay? Yeah. Nevertheless, the way that the US medical system has payouts, it's based on so-called RVUs, relative value units. And this is something where there's a government body that sets these prices, and it is in theory only for Medicare, but all the private insurers key off of that. And AMA basically publishes a list of these so-called the CPT codes, which is like the coding, the biomedical coding of this, and what each medical process is worth and whatnot. So it's like, I don't remember all the numbers, but it's like a 5-digit code, and it's like, okay, I got a test for cystic fibrosis, or a test for this, or a test for that. God help you if your medical billing is erroneous. Why? The insurance company will reject it because it doesn't pay for that. This is this giant process of trying to encode every possible ailment and condition into these CPT codes, and that you can literally get degrees in medical billing just for this. Okay, this enormous, inefficient industry. Yeah. Okay, like literally, medical billing is a whole field. Okay.
Yeah. Now, what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to work in medical billing.
In medical billing, okay, where everybody's mad at you at all times.
Yeah.
Part of what happens is when you give a treatment, when a doctor gives a treatment to a patient, they can't like repo the treatment. Okay, like a car, you sell a car, you can in theory repo the car. So the patient has a treatment. Now, what happens? Well, the insurance company, that treatment is perhaps provided. Look, it's a lab test provided by a company, right? The company bills the patient. The company is supposed to charge a high price. Why? The insurance company wants it to try to collect from the patient. The patient is scared. Oh my God, they see this huge price. They sometimes don't pay. Sometimes the insurance company doesn't pay either. And when a company is stiffed by an insurance company, when a diagnostic company is stiffed by an insurance company, it has to jack up the price on everybody else, right? Everything boils down to the fact that you don't have, a buyer and a seller. The doctor doesn't know the price of what is being sold. The buyer doesn't know the price of what is being bought at the time it's being bought. Neither party can really even set a free price because there's this RVU system that hovers above. The buyer feels they've already bought it because they bought insurance. The insurance company doesn't want to pay for it. Everybody is trying to like push the price onto somebody else and, not actually show the sticker price of anything and hide everything and so on and so forth. Oh, the other thing about it is obviously lawsuits are over everything. Everybody's mad about everything. It's health. People are dying. Okay. So everything is just optimized for optics as opposed to results, right? Similarly, actually, many drugs are optimized for minimizing side effects and optics rather than maximizing effects, which are totally different criteria, right? You might have, for example, a drug that only cures 1,000 people but doesn't have any side effects versus one that cures 1 million people but that has 10 really serious side effects a year, right? And the second one would probably not happen because those side effects would be so big. Okay. How do you attack this? I name a few examples, but I actually think the reform is going to come in part from outside the system. In particular, India is coming online. Okay. Why is that important? Well, you may have encountered an Indian doctor or two. Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe an Indian programmer, one or two. All right. Mm-hmm. And I do think telemedicine could explode, right? Where you could have an Indian doctor, in India, and there's a US doctor, okay, who's like a dispatcher. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. They've got all these other Indian doctors behind them. They've got a telemedical app, and you are now doing something where these relatively inexpensive Indian doctors who are vetted by the American doctor or the doctor in the jurisdiction of the license become the back-end doctors of the world. To some extent, this is already there with teleradiology and other kinds of things, right? But now that you've got literally like 1 billion Indians who've just come online, okay, you have this huge pool of folks who have a different attitude towards medicine. For example, it's a lot more cash payment over there. For example, India is big on generic drugs. For example, during COVID, it had something called Arogya Setu, which is a national telemedicine app. Okay, the US wasn't able to ship that. In some ways, India's digital infrastructure, again, you'll have to read a post called The Internet Country by tigerfeathers.substack.com, and you'll see that actually India's national software infrastructure is surprisingly good. It's not as good as China's in some ways, but it's like better than the US's, which is like healthcare.gov and like non-existent. It's like kind of impressive how good some of India's software is. The fact that it exists is good. So you have all these new doctors coming online. India cranks out generics, right? Telemedicine is now more legal in the US. And you have cash payment in India, right? And in a lot of other places. You don't have the whole insurance, employer health thing. And this market is growing. So you could have a sort of parallel market that starts evolving, right? Which is, and people are already doing some medical tourism. I think that's another exit from the FDA. You have a parallel market that starts evolving that just starts from fundamentally different premises. It's just cash for everything, right? There's downsides with cash for everything. There's a huge upside with cash for everything. Cash for everything means you get customer service from the doctor. It means the prices are actually visible. It ideally pushes you, again, towards more ambulatory medicine rather than ambulance medicine. It is monitoring, constant monitoring with the quantified self and whatnot, as opposed to just let your system fail and then wheel you in, right? There's a reputational bridge because now we've had a couple of generations almost of Indian doctors in the US. So people know that there's some very competent Indian doctors. They're a good chunk of AMA. And so they can sort of lobby for this. And you have plenty of Indian engineers. Now, I'm not saying India alone is a panacea, but I do think that this is a large enough parallel market to start doing interesting things.
And you could see sort of medical tourism, medical migration to where it gives India an opportunity to basically let go of the constraints of the FDA.
Yeah, because
and innovate aggressively, and I mean, it's just such a huge opportunity to define the future of medicine and make a shit ton of money from a market that's desperate for it in the United States because of all the over the regulation.
That's right. And I think basically it's something where the reason it needs
and
to
that would fix the FDA. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, we fix the FDA by exiting the FDA,
Yeah.
right?
And then the FDA would dry out, and then it would hopefully...
It might reform, it might dry out, right? And this is, why people are, for example, they're traveling across borders, they're getting orders from Canadian pharmacies.
Yeah.
A lot of this type of stuff, we can start to build alternatives, right? I mean, India's generic industry is really important because it just doesn't enforce American IP there. So generic drugs are cheaper, right? And it's quite competent. It's been around for a while. So there's enough proof points there where, again, I'm not saying a panacea. It's going to be something which will require like American and Indian collaboration. I think there's going to be a lot of other countries and so on that are involved. Mm-hmm. But you can start to see another pole getting set up, which is a confident enough civilization that is willing to take another regulatory path, right? And that is in some ways doing better on national software than the US is. And it has enough of a bridge to the US that it can be that stimulation which you need, which is kind of something, that outside poke.